Okay, well, one of the things I'm Salman Rushdie. We're having this working day. Welcome to it. I'm sure other people will join as the day goes on. And one of the reasons for having it was to reflect, like 25, 26 years later, after the Norman Mailer Congress of the mid-'80s, on some of the themes that were discussed there and what's happened since. And one of the things people forget about this sort of legendary 1986 Congress is that it was not open to the general public, that it was actually a closed Penn Congress, in which all the sessions were only for Penn members, and I guess members of the press. The new version of the festival is, I think, more rightly opened up to the public, and that has been a great thing. But I think it's good that we have this day to just talk amongst ourselves, so to speak. I wanted just to say a few things about that old Congress, because just to set the tone, as it were. One of the things that I remember about it, because I was there as a much younger writer, listening to all these grand figures of world literature. It was quite a gathering of voices: Czeslaw Milosz, Günter Grass, Saul Bellow, anybody you can think of, really, John Updike, Susan Sontag, Nadine Gordimer, on and on and on. And me, as the kid in the corner. And one of the things I remember about it, which is really different, I think, from the Penn festivals we've been having now, is how bad-tempered it was. How all the writers were fighting with each other like cats and dogs. There was Cynthia Ozick, I remember, got very upset that there was a panel in which politicians had been invited to speak: Pierre Trudeau, Bruno Kreisky, other figures like that. And Cynthia Ozick decided that Bruno Kreisky was an anti-Semite. And this was in spite of the fact that Bruno Kreisky is Jew, and had, in fact, Austria, under his leadership, had accepted more refugee Jews from the Soviet Union than any other country. In spite of this, he was anti-Semitic, and the reason is that he had had one brief meeting with Yasser Arafat. And so she was collecting signatures against him and so on, and stood up from the floor of the Congress to denounce him in his session. And I've always thought he responded with enormous aplomb. He just said, look, there's a lot of people in this room. It's too big a session in order to discuss these very important matters. So he said, what I suggest, this was at the Essex House Hotel on Central Park South. He said, what I suggest is after the session ends that we find a room in the hotel, and I will undertake to be there with no time limit to discuss whatever you want to discuss. Thus immediately defeating the protest completely, because of course nobody wanted to do that. So that shut her up. There was a big quarrel between Grace Paley, representing the views of a number of female delegates, that they were seriously underrepresented on the panels, which was true, by the way. She got into a quarrel with Norman Mailer about that, which led to Norman's notorious remark that he hadn't set up this Congress to be pussy-whipped by Grace Paley, which led to Grace Paley being on the front page of the New York Post. I think that's really quite an achievement, which she cannot have expected would happen in her life. It also led to Sontag and Gordimer, in fact, dissenting from the kind of feminist objection. And Susan Sontag made her remark to say that literature was not an equal opportunity employer, which didn't go down at all well. But Susan kind of didn't care. So there was a big fight between Günter Grass and Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow had made, actually one of my favorite memories of the festival was that the opening ceremony was at the public library. And because Mailer had, in many people's view, mistakenly invited Secretary of State George Shultz to deliver the opening address, not long after he'd made a statement supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa, which meant that all the South African writers boycotted the event. Anyway, because Shultz was there, of course, there was this kind of almost presidential level of security around the public library. And we all had to bring various forms of ID, and Saul Bellow forgot to bring his ID. And this was actually quite soon after he won the Nobel Prize. And so there was this extraordinary sight that I saw of Saul Bellow sitting on a little chair like this, outside the entrance to the library, not being allowed in until Norman Mailer came up and vouched for him. You can just imagine how much Bellow enjoyed being vouched for by Mailer. And then, America's Nobel laureate was allowed into the room. So it was a very contentious time, but I think one of the reasons it was contentious is that people, all of us, writers, believed that the public role of the writer was important and needed to be argued out and was not kidding around, so people took it very seriously, and there was still a sense in 1986, 3 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, 2 years before Charter 88 in Czechoslovakia led the way towards the communist downfall there, a time when writers around the world were, in many ways, at the center of the national argument in a way that we may feel is no longer the case. And I think one of the things we may want to talk about is why that is and what should be done about it. There are clearly parts of the world in which it's still the case, and we have recognized in earlier sessions of this festival the problems that have been arising in China for artists and intellectuals. Our colleague Liao Yiwu has not been able to be here. He sent us, Penn and me personally, a very moving letter yesterday. We received in various forms and had translated, and we've now replied to that letter, and there's a press release going out today about that, so you should have a look at that. He was very appreciative of the gestures made on his behalf at the opening ceremony, the empty chair and so on, and said that he very much felt that he was here in spirit, even though he couldn't be here. So, and we sent back messages saying that we would certainly keep up the attention on his case. So there are obviously parts of the world where writers, filmmakers, painters, artists have been still very much at the forefront of that kind of national argument. And I don't know quite why it doesn't happen so much in America anymore. There was a time when, as I say, that Penn Congress, there were writers like Mailer and Sontag and Didion and DeLillo and Robert Stone and Michael Hare and the whole generation of writers who very consciously looked for a public voice, looked for a public role. And I'm not sure who their equivalents today might be, and if they're not there, why they're not there. That might be a thing to talk about. The idea of what's gone wrong. I mean, when we started this version of the festival, this incarnation of Penn's, if you like, public face. Sorry, this is my spinach. You hear the Popeye music. So, anyway, we felt at that time, 7 years ago, that there was really a place for writers, a role for writers in restarting a public conversation between the United States and the rest of the world, which at that moment of the Bush administration seemed to have been quite seriously derailed, that America wasn't really listening to the world's voices, and the world's voices were increasingly hostile to what America was saying and doing at that time. And we thought then that that wasn't particularly good for America, and it wasn't particularly good for the rest of the world either, that you needed to start rebuilding a bridge in which these conversations, even if they were tough conversations, could take place. And I think that did. I mean, I remember in the first year we deliberately invited a number of Arab writers so that those voices at that particular moment could be heard in this city. And they were the sessions that you couldn't get into for love or money. People were hanging off the rafters trying to come and hear those voices. So it was clear that amongst the American audience and generally the American public readership, there was an enormous hunger to hear those voices, and not just, if you like, the official voices and the kind of bullet points that you hear on the news. Clearly, times have changed, but I think that idea of a dialogue between the best, most interesting writers and intellectuals in the world and American readers and American writers, it's still a very important thing to continue.